Hello, in this lesson I will be demonstrating how to deploy Kube DNS to the cluster. So I have my cloud servers started up, and in order to deploy Kube DNS, I'm going to need to use kubectl. Now one way to do that is just to go ahead and log into one of the controller servers and use kubectl from there. You're free to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open an SSH tunnel to the load balancer, and I'll use it against the Kubernetes API load balancer. But in order to access that 6443 port, I've got to open that SSH tunnel. So I'm going to copy the public IP of my load balancer server, and then I'll use SSH to open that SSH tunnel. So I'll do an SSH-L, and I'm going to open a tunnel to port 6443, and I will listen on localhost :6443. And then I'll just put in user at, and then I'll paste in that public IP address of my load balancer server. So now that I'm logged in, my SSH tunnel is open, and as long as I leave this session open, the SSH tunnel will remain open. So I'm going to switch to a different terminal, and I'll just leave this one running. So in this terminal, I'm going to test out my connection just with a kubectl get nodes, and I can see that both of my nodes are up and running, but most of all, I've tested to make sure that my kubectl commands are working from my local kubectl installation as well. So now I'm ready to go ahead and configure kubedns, and I'll just paste in this command. I'm just doing a kubectl create-f, and I'm using this file. It's a ready-made kubedns configuration that is provided as part of the original Kubernetes the Hard Way guide from Kelsey Hightower. So we're using the same configuration that he was using in the original guide. I'll go ahead and run that command, and that's created a series of objects in order to deploy kubedns into my cluster. So next, we need to make sure that everything is working the way that we expect it to. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check on the status of my kubedns pod. This kubectl create that we just did actually deployed a kubedns pod. We need to make sure that that pod is up and running. So I'll do a kubectl get pods. And the kubedns pod actually has a label, so I can use this label to get just that pod. I'll do -l k8s-app equals kube-dns. And of course, it's in the kube system namespace, so I need to do a -in kube system. And there's my kubedns pod. What I'm looking for to make sure that it's up and running is I'm looking for the running status, and I'm looking for 3 out of 3 containers ready. When you do this, it may take a couple moments for it to fully start up. So if it doesn't say 3 out of 3 immediately, then just wait a few moments and then rerun that kubectl command. But it should start up and be ready to go pretty quickly. So now that my kubedns is up and running, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spin up a new pod, and I'm going to run an ns lookup inside that pod to test my kubedns service. So I'm just going to spin up a busybox pod, and this is just a small lightweight image that we can use for testing. Now I am using a specific version of busybox. I'm using 1.28. So when you're following along, make sure you use that same version, because as of right now, the latest version, which is 1.29, actually has some problems inside the image itself that are specifically related to DNS. So we don't want that to be confusing when we're trying to test DNS. We want to make sure that we have a good, clean image that we know works with DNS in order to properly test our kubedns configuration. So I'm going to run this busybox pod, and then I'm going to do another command to get a reference to the pod name, just to make it a little bit easier to reference the busybox pod name. So I'm just setting a temporary environment variable, and this command is going to output the name of that pod, and it's going to set that to this environment variable. So I'll just do an echo so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. This is just the name of my busybox pod, and I can use that variable to reference that. So now I need to do an ns lookup inside my busybox pod. So I'll just do a kubectl exec, and I'm going to use that environment variable to execute my command inside the busybox pod, and my command is just going to be ns lookup Kubernetes. Kubernetes is a domain name within my cluster that I should be able to look up using my Kube DNS installation. And sure enough, my BusyBox pod was able to successfully perform an NS lookup against that Kubernetes name. So I can see the IP address of that service here, as well as the fully qualified host name here. So the fact that I was able to successfully perform that DNS lookup shows me that my Kube DNS installation is configured correctly and working as expected. So now that I know everything's working, I'm ready to go ahead and clean up. So before I finish this lesson, I want to clean up that BusyBox pod that I created. Of course, we don't want to clean up the Kube DNS stuff because that's permanent configuration, but that BusyBox pod was created just for testing, and we want to clean that up just so that it doesn't get in our way in the future. So I'm just going to do a quick kubectl delete deployment BusyBox, and that will delete that BusyBox deployment and clean up that testing pod that we created just so that doesn't get in our way in any of the future lessons. So once you've cleaned up that BusyBox pod, you're ready to go on to the next lesson.